Good afternoon. Russia has attacked Ukraine. This is a brutal act of war. Our thoughts are with the brave people of Ukraine. Sadly, what we have warned against for months has come to pass. Despite all calls on Russia to change course and tireless efforts to seek a diplomatic solution, peace on our continent has been shattered. We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history. We have just finished a meeting of the North Atlantic Council to discuss the situation. The Council also addressed the request by Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia to hold urgent consultations under Article 4 of the Washington Treaty. This is a grave moment for the security of Europe. Russia's unjustified and unprovoked attack on Ukraine is putting countless innocent lives at risk. With air and missile attacks, ground forces and special forces from multiple directions, targeting military infrastructure and major urban centers. This is a deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned invasion. Despite its litany of lies, denials and disinformation, the Kremlin's intentions are clear for the world to see. Russia's leaders bear full responsibility for their reckless actions and the lives lost. NATO allies condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. It is a blatant violation of international law, an act of aggression against a sovereign, independent and peaceful country, and a serious threat to Euro-Atlantic security. We call on Russia to immediately cease its military action, withdraw its forces from Ukraine, and choose diplomacy. We fully support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and Ukraine's right to self-defense. Russia is using force to try to rewrite history and deny Ukraine its free and independent path. NATO's core task is to protect and defend all allies. There must be no room for miscalculation or misunderstanding. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. This is our collective security guarantee. Today, the North Atlantic Council decided to activate our defense plans at the request of our top military commander, General Walters. This is a prudent and defensive step to protect and shield allied nations during this crisis. And it will enable us to deploy capabilities and forces, including the NATO response force, to where they are needed. In response to Russia's massive military buildup, we have already strengthened our collective defense, on land, at sea and in the air. In the last weeks, allies from North America and Europe have deployed thousands or more troops to the eastern part of the alliance and placed more on standby. We have over 100 jets at high alert, protecting our airspace, and more than 120 allied ships at sea from the high north to the Mediterranean. All this shows that our collective defense commitment, Article 5, is ironclad. We will continue to do whatever is necessary to shield the alliance from aggression. I have called a virtual summit of NATO leaders tomorrow to address the way forward. Russia is now facing severe costs and consequences imposed by the whole international community. The Kremlin's aim is to re-establish its sphere of influence, rip up the global rules that have kept us all safe for decades, and subvert the values that we hold dear. This is the new normal for our security. Peace cannot be taken for granted. Freedom and democracy are contested by authoritarian regimes, and strategic competition is on the rise. We must respond with renewed resolve and even stronger unity. North America and Europe together in NATO. We are an alliance of 30 democracies standing as one. We will protect our people and our values. Democracy will always prevail over autocracy. Freedom will always prevail over oppression. And then I'm ready to take your questions.
We'll go to Interfax Ukraine.
Thank you, Anna. Interfax Ukraine, Irina Sommer. Secretary General, we all know that NATO will not fight for Ukraine. But don't you think it's time for NATO to build anti-Putin coalition? Thank you.
NATO stands in solidarity with Ukraine, and NATO allies are imposing severe costs on Russia for the reckless invasion of Ukraine. NATO allies, in close coordination with the European Union and other partners all over the world, are now imposing severe economic sanctions on Russia to demonstrate that we follow up on what we said, and that is that it will be a high price for Russia to pay. NATO allies have also over a long period of time provided support, practical support, military support to Ukraine, and helped them to build a much stronger, much better equipped, much better trained armed force today than the Ukraine had in 2014. And I would like to recognize the professionalism and the bravery of the Ukrainian men and women in uniform who are now standing up against the Russian invasion. So we continue to stand together, condemning the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and allies stand together also in sending a message that we will never accept the brutal violation of international law that we see taking place as Russia now invades Ukraine.
We'll go to Bloomberg.
Do you have any information that shows that NATO allies face a direct threat from Russia at the moment? And would NATO reconsider military intervention in Ukraine? Thank you.
So NATO is the strongest alliance in history. And make no mistake, we will defend and protect every ally against any attack and every inch of NATO territory. And that's the reason also we have increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance with thousands of more troops, ships and planes over the last weeks. To send a very clear message that an attack on one ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance. And we do so not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent the conflict. What we do is defensive, it's prudent, it's measured, but it is necessary because we see the aggressive actions of Russia against Ukraine, and therefore allies also have to make sure that there is no room for any misunderstanding about that Russia can do anything like that against a NATO allied country.
National Public Radio.
Hi, thank you. Terry Schultz with NPR and DW. Mr. Secretary General, in the NAC statement, you say that we're deploying additional defensive land and air forces to the eastern part of the alliance, additional maritime assets, and increase the readiness of forces. Is this now today more forces being sent as a result of the fact that the invasion has now happened, or are you there referring to what has already been done as reinforcements? I understand Sakor will now have the ability to assemble the VJTF without coming back to the NAC for approval? And finally, are you still willing to sit down with President Putin or other representatives of the Russian government after this? Or are you suspending your offer to hold talks on other issues and the NATO-Russia Council? Thank you.
This invasion doesn't come as a surprise. We have warned against it for months. And sadly, what happened this morning during the night was something that Allied security and intelligence services have predicted for a long time. We have tried to prevent it by calling on Russia to engage in diplomatic efforts, by telling Russia that there will be severe costs, economic sanctions, if they invade Ukraine further. But what happened over the last hours, what has happened over the last hours, demonstrate that Russia, despite our diplomatic efforts and despite our clear messages of economic sanctions, decided to once again invade Ukraine. But since we have been warning against this for a long period of time, we have also taken prudent measures to prepare ourselves. And that's the reason why we, over the last months and weeks, have significantly increased the presence of NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance. More land troops, ground forces, but also air and naval forces. In the coming days and weeks, there will come even more. So we will further increase, and we are increasing our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. And today we activated NATO's defense plans that gives our military commanders more authority to move forces and to deploy forces when needed. And of course, this could also be elements of the NATO response force. So we are ready, we are adjusting our posture, but what we do is defensive, is measured, and we don't see confrontation. We want to prevent the conflict and any attack against any NATO allied country.
And for talks? Will you still sit down and talk?
Well, we have reached out to Russia for weeks and months, and what we've seen is that the Russian message has been that they actually have never taken these talks seriously, because while we were trying to find a political solution, they were planning for this invasion. And while we were trying to find a political solution, they were actually day by day, week by week, increasing their military presence and readiness on the borders of Ukraine, and now they launched invasion. So Russia has shut the door to a political solution. We regret that, but that's sadly the reality, which has severe and very serious consequences for the people of Ukraine, but also actually impacts the security for all of us. And that's the reason why we step up our presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung.
Thanks a lot for taking the question. Secretary General, actually two questions. The first one, I'd like to hear your reaction to what President Putin said this morning when he announced the military operations. He said that any country that interferes with them would face consequences greater than you have seen in your history, which I take as a veiled threat with a nuclear attack. So please, what's your response to that? He did not specify what interference means. And the second question, very simple, can the NATO-Russia Founding Act be upheld under these circumstances? Thank you.
The threatening rhetoric by President Putin and the aggressive actions by Russia, of course, is the reason why we are saying that we are now faced with a new normal for our security. And we need to consult closely all allies, and we also do that tomorrow when the leaders meet at the virtual summit. What does this mean for our longer-term relationship with Russia? How shall we continue to defend and protect allies in this new security reality? And how can we make sure that we uphold the values we believe in, freedom, democracy, faced with a more aggressive authoritarian regime in Moscow? A regime which is willing to openly contest our values and to threat and actually also use force to try to coerce other nations. So this will have some long-term effects on our security, on how we respond, on how NATO is reacting, and also on how our relationship with Russia can evolve. We don't have all the answers today, but there will be a new reality. It will be a new Europe after the invasion we saw today. And therefore I welcome the fact that we are so closely coordinating, so closely working together in NATO. We stood together in warning against the Russian aggression, the plans. We stood together in reaching out to Russia and try to prevent the attack. And now we need to stand together in responding to the attack. And that's exactly what we are doing. That was the first question. The second question? Well, that's part of this new reality we have to look into. And there will be a different reality, and we need to respond. But this is not the day to draw all the conclusions. But we will have an important discussion among leaders tomorrow.
And okay.
Thank you for the question. Mr. Secretary General, today Ukraine has called on Turkey to close the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits for Russian vessels. Is that an action that was discussed in this morning's meeting, and are there other similar actions that have been discussed today?
That was not discussed in the meeting today. Turkey is, of course, a NATO ally. Turkey has a special role when it comes to the Bosporus Straits, but this was not an issue in the meeting this morning. What we discussed this morning was the need to activate the defense plans. We made a decision to activate those plans, which enable us to move forces more quickly to where they are needed, and also to agree a statement where we express a very strong condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also announced that we are going to have a NATO summit, a virtual NATO summit tomorrow.
Wall Street Journal.
Dan Michaels, Wall Street Journal, thank you for the question. Could you talk a little bit more about the activation of the defense plans? What exactly does this change? And when was the last time this was done? Thank you.
These plans are plans we have developed over the years to make sure that we have plans in place to react to crises like the crisis we are faced with now. And they are defensive plans, they are prudent plans, and they are plans that covers the whole east of our lines from the Barents Sea down to the Mediterranean, and they give our military commanders some more authorities within politically defined guidelines and frameworks to deploy forces where they deem it needed, and that's exactly what we have agreed today. So these again are defensive plans, ensuring that we have forces at the sufficient readiness at the right place throughout Europe.
Associated Press.
Have they ever been activated before?
So I don't know whether it's right for me to answer that question, because I don't know whether it has been made public before, so I only said that we activated them today.
Associated Press.
Hello, Mark Carlson, Associated Press. Is the NATO response force inside Ukraine right now?
No, there are no NATO combat troops, no troops, NATO troops at all inside Ukraine. We have made it clear that we don't have any plans and any intention of deploying NATO troops to Ukraine. What we have made clear is that we have already increased, and we are increasing the presence of NATO troops in the eastern part of the lines on NATO territory. Ukraine is a highly valued partner. We have supported Ukraine for many, many years. We helped them to build a more modern, capable armed force, military. We have helped them to train, equip, and in many different ways strengthen their armed forces. We help them with cyber defenses, NATO and NATO allies in different ways. but we don't have NATO troops in Ukraine, and we don't have any plans to send NATO troops into Ukraine. But we are there to protect and defend all NATO allies. So we support Ukraine. We provide absolute security guarantees for NATO allies. And we demonstrate that commitment by increasing the presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
We'll try to take a couple of questions online before we come back to the press room. So we'll go to Steve Erlander from New York Times.
Thank you, Secretary General. Two quick questions. One, do you still have military deconfliction contacts with Russian forces today? Are those ongoing? And secondly, a lot of NATO countries are going to want to keep supplying weapons to Ukraine. Do you foresee this as a major risk of NATO-Russia conflict? And where else do you see risks of conflict now between Russia and NATO countries that could spill over into something worse? Thank you, sir.
We have increased the presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and we have activated NATO defense plans today to make sure that we do not see any spillover to NATO territory. Because as long as Russia knows that an attack on a NATO ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance, they will not attack, because we are the strongest alliance in history. And as long as we stand together and make clear that we are committed by our collective defense commitments, that's the best way to prevent any attack, any spillover from the tragedy, the heinous attack we see in Ukraine, spillover onto any NATO allied country. The NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine in many different ways over the last years, especially since 2014. NATO has helped them with the cyber defenses. We have also helped them with some different trust funds for different activities, and then on top of that, and different capacity building measures help them to strengthen, including the naval forces and other elements of their armed forces. But then on top of what NATO has done as an alliance, NATO allies have also provided military equipment, including defensive weapons and other types of support training. It will be a national decision in what way allies continue to provide support. So that's for individual NATO allies to decide. Deconfliction is extremely important for us. There has been contacts between our military commanders and Russia. We will continue to reach out to them to make sure that we do everything we can to ensure deconfliction.
We'll next go to Helsingin Sanomat, Teija Sutinen.
Yes, this is Teija Sutinen from the newspaper Helsingin Sanomat. What is your message to the partnership countries, Finland and Sweden, in this situation? At least in Finland, there's a discussion about the possible NATO membership, but is this realistic during a crisis? Thank you.
Finland and Sweden are very close partners, and I have taken careful note of the very clear message, both from Finland and Sweden, that even though they don't apply for membership now, they strongly believe that NATO should not sign any kind of agreement with Russia based on what Russia has proposed for us to sign a legally binding agreement ending any enlargement of NATO in the future. So I've seen that Sweden and Finland states that for them this is a question of self-determination, the sovereign right to choose their own path, and then potentially in the future also to apply for NATO membership. So for me, the very clear messages from Finland and Sweden just has underpinned how important it is that NATO allies do not compromise on core values, including the right for every nation to choose its own path, meaning whether it wants to belong to NATO or not belong to NATO. NATO respects those decisions, regardless if it's yes or no to joining a NATO. we very much value the close partnership with Finland and Sweden. It's important for NATO, it's important for Finland and Sweden. I visited Finland and Sweden this fall together with North Atlantic Council, and we see how closely we work together, exercise together, increase our ability to operate together, interoperability, and we also have very close political consultations. And therefore, I have invited Sweden and Finland to the virtual summit tomorrow, the NATO summit tomorrow. So at the NATO summit tomorrow, we will have Sweden, Finland, and the two EU presidents present, showing in a way the very strong unity we demonstrate, transatlantic, NATO, and also close partners, EU, Finland, and Sweden.
We'll go to Polish radio.
Beata Płomecka, Polish Radio. If I may, follow-up question to Terry's question. When exactly this high readiness element of the NATO response force may be deployed? Is it up to the leaders if you convey the summit for tomorrow? Thank you.
First of all, we have already deployed thousands of troops. And for instance, to Poland, there are more US forces, there are more forces from the United Kingdom, and there are also all the nations deploying more forces to Poland, and also to other countries in the eastern part of the alliance. More ships in the Baltic Sea, and more planes conducting air policing and protecting our airspace. So this is going on, and there will be more forces in the east of the alliance over the next days and weeks. Then that could include elements of the NATO response force, but the most important thing is not exactly which elements or which forces, but the most important thing for Poland, for the other allies in the eastern part of the alliance, is that there are more NATO forces in the east. And there is, and there will be even more NATO forces in the east in the coming days and weeks.
Final question to TV2.
Thank you for the question, Mrs. Sørsdal from TV2 Norway. Secretary General, you have received apparently very good intelligence in recent weeks. You have shared it, you have been open about it. Do you have any information of the Russian plans ahead?
So our intelligence has been very precise because it has predicted over now several months the military build-up, but also the intentions, the plans of Russia to attack Ukraine. But of course, those plans could always be changed. And we continue to call on Russia to change its course and to not attack. And then we saw this morning that they attacked. And that was no surprise, because that was exactly what our intelligence services have predicted over several months. We have shared that intelligence to mainly try to prevent Russia from attacking. We have shared intelligence not only about the military build-up, but also about all the different attempts by Russia to create a pretext, stage situations that they can use as an excuse. These absolutely false claims of genocide against the Russians, or the alleged sabotage actions inside Russia and so on. It is false. It is staged. But we exposed those attempts because we hoped that that could reduce the risk of a military invasion. We have seen that they have stick to their plans. They have done as they actually planned for a long time ago. And we need to understand that throughout all these weeks and months, when they said that they have no plans of invading Ukraine, they had plans. And they were not only having plans, but they actually built up all these forces with one clear aim, and that was to invade Ukraine. And despite that, they were telling us and the world and the public that we have no plans to invade Ukraine. Yes, they had plans, and now we have seen that actually they were serious about invading Ukraine all the time. Never serious about really engaging in diplomatic efforts. What we see now is a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine from multiple directions. We see air, land, and naval forces taking part in those attacks. It's too early. We don't have a full damage assessment yet, but this is extremely serious. It's an attack on a peaceful, sovereign, independent nation, and it is a war of a type and a scale we actually thought was part of history in Europe, but now it's back in real, and it's imposing enormous suffering on innocent people in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference.
Thank you.